Red Dwarf, Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers by Grant Naylor. Episode 6. Lost in deep space, the crew of Red Dwarf received an SOS message from Nova 5, a ship crash-landed on a nearby moon. Going to the rescue, they discovered a crew who had been dead for 3 million years, Crichton, a deluded android, and the duality jump drive. On discovering his crew really were dead, Crichton dismantled himself and switched himself off. But Lister put him back together, learnt the secret of the duality jump, and before they knew it, they were back on Earth. Lister immediately retired to a town called Bedford Falls, just like the Bedford Falls in his favourite movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And Rimmer has become immensely rich. But all is not well. Lister's arms are beginning to hurt, and when he rubs ointment onto them, it reveals the word dying. Rimmer got out of the lift and walked past the pool on the roof garden. Hugo, one of the gardening staff, was aqua-vacking cherry blossoms from the surface of the water.
Monsieur Rimmer!
He called.
Madame Juanita, she is unwell again.
Rimmer sighed. Unwell was a code for his wife having one of her regular tantrums. Juanita Chicata was unquestionably the most beautiful woman in the world. Eyes the colour of fire, panther black hair, dangerous lips, dangerous woman. She'd made 2 fortunes, the first as the world's #1 model, the second as the world's #1 actress. And she was 19 years old. She had beauty, brains, talent, everything. God had finally got it right. Every man desired her. And she'd married Rimmer. While Lister had ended up with a very ordinary girl-next-door type, he'd acquired the Brazilian bombshell. Right now, the Brazilian bombshell was exploding in the master bedroom of their penthouse apartment. Rimmer wandered through the exotic Chinese roof garden while 400 catering staff prepared for the customary Saturday night party. The 300-yard-long buffet table was crammed to overflowing with food which had been flown in from around the world earlier that day, the centerpiece of which was a replica of Juanita's naked body in caviar. He paused to admire it. Even like this, even sculpted from little black fish eggs, it was a body that drove him crazy. He couldn't help himself. He leaned over and nibbled at the splendid right breast. The real ones were insured for 10 million each, and she hadn't let him near them for over a year and a half. As he walked into the master bedroom, he found Juanita hurling dollops of cold cream at an original Picasso. Rimmer sighed and shook his head.
"Nita, Nita," he cooed. "What is it? What has disturbed my little turtle dove?"
"Hugo! He won't make love to me anymore. Not ever. He's afraid you'll find out and sack him."
"Well, he's got a point,"
Rimmer found himself saying. Then it hit him.
Juanita and Hugo? His hairy-shouldered pool attendant had caressed that fabulous bosom? What would the insurance company say?
Lister sat in the red glow of the firelight and looked down at his arms. How was it possible for pain to spell out words? Dying. What did that mean? He was dying? That something inside him was dying? He looked across at his right arm. 4 letters and a symbol. But he didn't know what they meant. Some fairly bizarre things had happened since he returned to Earth. Finding Bedford Falls, the way he'd always imagined it. Finding someone who was the exact duplicate of Christine Kachansky, who just happened to fall in love with him almost instantly and give him twin sons. And the boys, both beautiful, both perfectly formed, never any trouble. They never cried, they never whined. They even changed one another's nappies. Wasn't that a bit odd? Self-nappy-changing babies? Lister didn't know much about babies, but Chrissy had always accepted it as normal behavior, so he had too. Also, he didn't know exactly when babies started to walk and talk, but Jim and Bexley were only 15 months old, yet they could play the piano, converse like adults, and even toss a 0G ball about with him in the back garden. He didn't like where his thoughts were leading him.
How many times had it been Christmas Eve since he arrived at Bedford Falls? 500, 600? In fact, wasn't it always Christmas Eve? Bexley padded down the stairs in his Donald Duck sleep suit and goofy slippers.
Hi, Dad. I'm just going to pop down to Old Man Gower's. Do you want anything?
Lister shook his head. Bexley stood on tiptoe and opened the front door. Lister heard the Model A Ford start up as Bexley roared off into town. Now that was weird. A 15-month-old baby driving into town to get some milk for his brother. It was barely believable. Well, it wasn't believable. It was impossible. Lister looked down at the message on his right arm. 4 letters, 1 symbol. A chill passed through him. He knew what it meant. U equals BTL. He knew what it meant. It was a gloriously warm summer's evening, with just enough breeze to make it perfect. The Rimmers were having a party. Arnie and Juanita were entertaining, and anybody who was anybody was there. The 400-piece New York Philharmonic Orchestra, flown in especially for the evening, were playing a tribute to James Last. The prima donnas from the Bolshoi Ballet were arranged around the roof garden in gilded cages, spinning and pirouetting to entertain the guests. 5,000 guests in all. One of the waiters leaned over and whispered discreetly,
"There's a gentleman in the main reception who insists on seeing you, sir.
"Send him away."
He says his name is Lister, sir. Claims he was your cohort on the Red Dwarf."
Lister stood in the mahogany-panelled library. He helped himself to a foot-long Havana cigar and sat in the huge leather reading chair. The 12-feet-high double doors swung open, and Rimmer strode in, grinning.
"Listy! Long time no see. I was going to invite you, but,
You've done pretty well for yourself.
I'm getting by. So, 2 years. Has it really been 2 years?
Yup.
So, you finally came to see me. How much do you want? 1, 2, 3, 4 pounds?
Rimmer threw back his head and brayed loudly. You're a smeghead, Rimmer. You really are a smeghead.
But a rich smeghead, eh? Seriously, what do you want? A couple of mil?
I want, Lister said, leaning forward, to go back to Earth.
Come again?
This isn't Earth. Rimmer smiled uncomprehendingly. I'm afraid, Arn, we've taken the wrong turning. Somehow we've wound up playing better than life. We're just a couple of gameheads. Better Than Life was intended to be the zenith of computer game technology. A metal band was placed across the forehead, and underneath it, needle-thin electrodes punctured the skull and burrowed into the frontal lobes. Tiny computer chips in the electrodes transmitted signals directly to the brain. No screens, no joysticks. You were really there, wherever you wanted to be. It was only a month after its release that people realized it was addictive. Better Than Life was withdrawn from the market, but illicit electronic labs began to make copies. It was the ultimate hallucinogen, with only one real major drawback. It killed you. Once you entered Better Than Life, once you put on the headband and the needles wormed into your mind, it was almost impossible to get out. This was partly because you weren't even aware you were in Better Than Life in the first place. The game protected itself, hid itself from your memory. Your conscious mind was totally subverted while your body slowly withered and died. At first, well-meaning friends tried to rescue gameheads by yanking the headset out of the skull, but this always resulted in instant death from shock. The only way out of the game was to want to leave it. But no one ever wanted to leave. Rimmer followed Lister down the narrow white stone steps to the roof garden, where the party was still in full swing. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. Lister was jealous, plain and simple. The poor boy had flipped.
Heard from the cat? No, he's on some island off Denmark. Haven't heard from him since we got back to Earth. You?
Lister shook his head. grabbed a bottle of Dom Perignon from a passing ice bucket, and they sat down. He rolled back his sleeves. "Let me show you me arms."
Your arms?
Both me arms look perfectly normal, don't they?
Rimmer looked down at his perfectly normal arms and nodded. He started looking round for his bodyguards.
But they hurt like hell. And when I put ointment over the spots that hurt, it spells out a message.
Rimmer shook his head, smiling.
Amazing!
Watch.
Lister took a jar of cold cream out of his jacket pocket and daubed dying on his left arm, and U equals BTL on his right. Someone's trying to get a message to us.
On your arms through the cold cream?
Look, if we are in the game, we won't know we're in the game. It protects itself. It won't let you remember that you've started to play it.
But we didn't start to play it.
No, we don't remember starting to play it. That's different.
Rimmer flopped back in his seat and looked round the roof garden. He looked across at the sous chef atop a ladder, carving generous portions of meat from the barbecued giraffe which slowly rotated on the 40-foot spit. Could this really not be real?
If we're in the game, we're wandering around somewhere with electrodes in our brains, totally oblivious to the real world. Someone in that real world is trying to tell us where we are by burning or cutting or scratching a message into my arms. U equals BTL. You are in better than life. And dying. In reality, I'm dying. I'm a gamehead.
But it doesn't make sense. I thought when you're in the game, all your fantasies were supposed to come true. But look at you, stuck in some hick town in the back end of nowhere with a wife and 2 kids and no money.
Money isn't important to me.
Rimmer snorted.
Bedford Falls and everything else. That was everything I always wanted. Come on, Rimmer. Face facts. Look at this place. The Rimmer building, overlooking the Champs-Élysées. Your company inventing the solidogram. You're married to the most famous actress in the world. Is any of it even remotely credible?
Lister stood up.
Who the hell are they? The guys under the parasol?
Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar and General Patton.
And what are they doing here?
Rimmer Corporation Worldwide, PLC, have developed a time machine. I've been playing around with it for a few months, inviting famous people from different eras in time to pep up a few dinner parties. Lister was looking at him in a strange way. What's wrong with that? You don't think that's believable?
No, I don't.
I think you just wanted to meet these people, so your imagination had to cook up a nearly credible explanation to bring them here.
Nonsense, said Rimmer, but without conviction. Could it be true? Could he have fantasized the invention of a time machine just so he could bring back Caesar, Bonaparte and Patton, the 3 greatest generals in history, simply in order to beat them at Risk, the strategic war game for ages 15 and over? Could he really be that small-minded?
Come on.
Lister drained the bottle.
We've got to find the cat.
The black stretch Mercedes with a tinted bulletproof glass purred onto the shiny black tar-macadam runway of Rimmer International Airport and drew up alongside the black Learjet, Rimmer 1. As they got to the top of the Learjet steps, the screaming started. Rimmer had been dreading it. He'd hoped they might be able to slip aboard unnoticed, but even this small mercy was denied him. As Lister turned, hanging over the observation balcony of the airport terminal building, 20,000 teenage girls caught in the helpless throes of Rimmer mania waved intimate garments and banners, screamed and chanted uncontrollably.
Arnold! We love you! Arnie!
Rimmer shook his head in humiliation, his cheeks glowing baboon bottom red. Lister squinted, trying to read the banners. Arnie is brave, he could make out. Arnie is fab. He turned to Rimmer.
Basically, he grinned. You just want to be adored, don't you?
Look, we're still not 100% sure that this is a fantasy. And if it turns out it's not, you're going to feel plenty silly as you drive your clapped-out old banger back to Nowhere City. Rimmer ducked his head and disappeared into the body of the plane.
Lister sat there looking at the black and white dog-eared snaps, which Mr. Culhoun, the photographer, had taken last Christmas Eve with his old box brownie on its tripod, with the magnesium flare. There was one in particular of him and Kochanski with big cheesy grins. He was still hung up on Christine Kochanski, a girl he dated for 5 weeks and 2 days 3 million years ago. In a way, he was kind of jealous of Rimmer. If he'd have known it was a fantasy, he'd have become Jim Bexley Speed and dated Ida Lupino. He'd have played with the Beatles, the Fab Five, John, Paul, George, Ringo and Dave. But he hadn't. He'd settled down in Bedford Falls and married Christine Kochanski. He'd wanted to live his life in a movie. What a jerk. The Lear landed in Copenhagen. The Danish government laid on a powerboat to get them across to the Cat's Island. They moored the boat at a crumbling wooden jetty and looked around, trying to find a route up the unclimbable mountain. They heard a sound, a creaking steel chain, and crashing out of the soggy mist, a cable car lurched to a halt in front of them. The trip took 3 hours. They went through cloud. The atmospheric pressure changed. Finally, the cable car wheezed into its mooring. Standing on a narrow mountain track were 2 rickshaws, attended by 8-foot-tall, huge-breasted Amazon Valkyries in scanty armor. Any faint hopes that Rimmer still entertained, that they were on Earth and in the world of reality, gurgled noisily down the plug hole as they gazed up at the Cat's home. It was a 30-towered golden castle, surrounded by a moat filled with milk. They were led into the castle and through a maze of chambers, which let out onto a courtyard surrounded by stables. The Cat, in a red riding jacket, gleaming white joppers, and black leather boots, was mounted on a cream-coloured, fire-breathing racing yak. There was a smell of sulphur hanging in the air as the yak reared and tried to bolt. The Cat deftly wrestled it under control, laughing as it haughtily spouted 2 more jets of fire from its nostrils. A dozen hunting dogs yapped and bayed and snapped at the leashes held by 4 Valkyries. The Cat turned and caught sight of Rimmer and Lister. He waved his black riding cap and tooted his hunting horn.
Guys, grab a yak!
The Cat called to the Valkyries, restraining the hounds.
Release the dogs!
The dozen hunting dogs screamed out of the courtyard. The Cat reared on his yak and bellowed,
Tally-ho!
And all 3 of them thundered over the cobblestones and out into the dank, misty wasteland that surrounded the castle. As they hammered across the hard, frosty ground, Lister saw the Cat level his pistol. What on earth could they be hunting? He saw the Cat's shoulder jerk back and a puff of smoke before he heard the crack of the pistol. In the distance, one of the dogs cartwheeled 12 feet into the air and landed dead on the floor.
No!
Lister yelled as the Cat quickly picked off the 11 remaining dogs.
You shot all the smegging dogs? They're vermin! What did you think we were shooting?
They stood before the roaring fire in the vast inglenook fireplace of the Cat's baronial dining hall. The Cat stood, resting a spat-covered foot on the gold fender, his elbow crooked on the marble mantelpiece, shaking his head, staring into the fire.
You mean none of this is real? None of this actually exists?
Of course it doesn't, Rimmer snorted in disgust.
Fire-breathing yaks? 8-foot-tall Nordic goddesses? A castle surrounded by a moat of milk? I mean, at least our fantasies were possible. Perhaps not likely, but possible. But yours is just totally preposterous. Didn't you think it was a little bit odd the way you just acquired all this? No, I just thought I deserved it.
Deserved it? Lister tilted his head.
Because I'm so good looking. I think we've established beyond all reasonable doubt that we are playing better than life.
Right, but the question is, how do we get out?
I think I can answer that,
said a fourth voice. A familiar figure waddled through the stone archway, and he started to explain everything.
Rimmer lurched happily down the corridor.
It's a funny thing,
He slurred.
even though I've had so much to drink, I'm in total confac of my mantelties. Where is he?
Said Lister, tugging the ring pull on another bottle of self-heating sake. They'd be back on Earth in 3 months, and they'd spent the day celebrating down in the Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar. The evening had gurgled by in a blurry haze of ever more elaborate cocktails before either of them had realized the cat had been missing for 2 days. Lister had led the drunken safari up to the habitation deck to find him. There were over 3,000 separate sleeping quarters on this deck alone, and they had looked through more than half of them before they staggered into Petrovich's old room. The 2 lockers had been pulled away from the wall, and in a crudely chiseled recess was a stack of game headbands. Petrovich, the high-flying, career-minded leader of A-Shift, had been smuggling better than life. The cat gently rocked on the sleeping quarters armchair, giggling insanely. The silver headband glimmered menacingly on his head, the electrodes buried deep inside his brain. His face was painted with the vacant grin of the lost soul of a gamehead. The 3 of them sat around the banquet table in the baronial hall of the cat's fantasy, as Crichton recounted how Lister had followed the cat into the game.
But better than life's addictive? I knew that.
You were drunk, Mr. David. You thought you'd be okay just to go into the game and tell the cat what danger he was in. But once you'd linked up, you didn't come out.
What about me? Why did I go in?
You were drunk too. You said you had the willpower to drag them both out, and that was the last we saw of you.
Crichton told how they had wandered around Red Dwarf in the twilight zombie state the game induced, how he'd done his best to feed them and keep them from harming themselves. But over the months, the cat's and Lister's bodies had begun to wither. How in desperation he'd begun lasering the messages into Lister's arms to warn him of the danger. This had distressed Crichton greatly. It was built into his software that he mustn't harm human beings. Months of cajoling by Holly had finally persuaded him that not to do it would hurt Lister even more. But still, the 3 of them remained in the game. In the end, Crichton had no choice but to enter himself.
But that's stupid. You'll get addicted too.
Crichton shook his head.
Holly was right. I'm immune.
Immune? Why are you immune?
Crichton cracked his face into a hollow grin.
I'm a mechanoid. I don't have fantasies the way you do. I have very few expectations or desires.
Very few. Then you do have some.
A Valkyrie appeared, bearing a brand-new, freshly wrapped squeezy mop.
Only one,
said Crichton, accepting the gift and tearing off the paper.
Oh, wonderful. A squeezy mop. Just what I've always wanted.
The windscreen wipers patted the snow into neat white triangles on the Model A's window as the car grunted past the white-coated sign, Bedford Falls, 2 miles. He was leaving the game. It was easy to leave the game, easier than he'd have thought. First, you had to want to leave, and of course, to want to leave, you had to know you were in the game in the first place. Then, it was only a matter of finding an exit. Just that. A door marked exit.
And where are these doors?
He'd asked Crichton.
It's your fantasy. They're wherever you want them to be.
So there it was. All he had to do was imagine an exit and go through it. He'd pass through the exit and find himself back on Red Dwarf. Once back, he could remove his headband. No, destroy his headband. Destroy them all. Then start the long haul back to health. But it was an individual matter. They all had to create their own separate exits. Alone. You're born alone, you die alone, you leave the game alone. The glimmering lights of Bedford Falls twinkled in the valley below, as for the last time, he made his way down the hill to his personal Shangri-La. There in the middle of the street, a pink neon sign hung over a shimmering archway. There was his exit, just as he'd imagined it. On the other side was reality. It started to snow. Christmas Eve. He couldn't leave them on Christmas Eve. But of course, in Bedford Falls, it was always Christmas Eve.
Red Dwarf, Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, was written by Grant Naylor and performed by Chris Barry. Additional music and effects were by Nick Graham. Technical presentation by John Etchells. Produced by Chris Wallace.